Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Hello, everyone.
Good morning.
Today's topic is going to be around our change management. This is an article that was released by Microsoft right after, it's actually in the Fabric adoption roadmap. Some things have been updated, right? It used to be the Power BI adoption roadmap. Now it has changed to Fabric. So now going through the Fabric experience, there is some new articles that have been coming out, and we're going to talk today around the change management piece of this. It's kind of towards the end of the article. The adoption roadmap is amazing. There's a ton of content in there. And I highly recommend if you are a leader or running your Power BI deployment, go read this from Microsoft. This is just one of the portions of articles around this one. Before we do that, let's just do some news. Tommy, you have any news or anything that came out recently on the blogs?
Yeah, I've been seeing Tabular Editor's actually been doing two really great blogs around the ability to build a semantic model right off of everything in Fabric. I think actually our good friend Johnny Winter wrote one. I know that Kurt's been working on them too. I don't know if I would have the same positive attitude. So I messaged you guys this week, and I just want to put a friendly PSA out there compared to how we've always dealt with data types and all of our models that we've really built to date. Basically, I'll give the workflow, pushing things in from data flows Gen 2. And actually that's going, and then that's going to the Lakehouse. And then I'm building not the default data set, but a separate one. And I wanted to build it all in Tabular Editor 3 because I was really actually copying one that I was doing. I'm like, I'm going to migrate it over. A lot of measures. Didn't want to spend all my time in a browser when F5 used to be applying and now it also refreshes your browser. So those little things. So built it in Tabular Editor 3. And it's been working fine. And then all of a sudden I noticed that I started getting all these error messages for any of those data. So like that data set, I'm like, what happened? Did something happen on the table? Well, it's a very cryptic message with a link. So I went to check it out and it just said, can't do a data type conversion. I'm like, since we're not doing any Power Query anymore, like, what are we talking about? So it turns out, and I'll put the link in here as well, that even though we've always dealt with the 8 data types in SQL databases, there's a lot more and in our world, but Microsoft has some trouble right now if the original source getting pushed is one of the data types. And I'm not saying we're moving from a number to text. It's simply the options in Tabular Editor are the ones that would be in Power BI. Those aren't the same exact light types in, I think, what's in Fabric. Even though they look the same from the outside, this is the same with DAX too. It's not the same exact type. But now, since it's direct lake, it just can't read it back. So it's one of those like really hidden features. You never know actually about DAX and Power Query, but with this will cause an error. Because even if I'm saying, you know what, I'm actually going to change it here. Why does it say general? I want this to be a currency value.
This kind of makes sense because Power Query has been the great protector of data types previously, right? So every time you bring things into Power BI, you'd use Power Query, and then it would only let you pick the acceptable data types you would need to make your model on top of. But you're right. I mean, there is a lot of other data sources out there, SQL Server. There's other definitions of data types, and I believe the OneLake is only storing the data types that it sees from the source system sometimes. So there just could be some cleanup there around some issues around that to fix that for you as you bring data in. One more reason why it makes more sense to have a bronze, silver, gold layer inside your lake, because bringing your data in directly into an earlier layer allows you to change data types to the next layer, cleaning up, make sure it's right and ready to go for downstream things.
I haven't even given you guys the kicker yet. So, but this is just one of those things that you always get aware of. It's like, okay, quick fix, right? Well, if that ever does occur in a Fabric, the only way to remedy it is to remove the table from the model and then bring it back in again. So if you had relationships and everything built off, also, you can only do that on the web. And then just to mix it all up, if you edit a semantic model in a third-party tool, you can't edit on the web anymore.
That would make sense because you're going to be able to do everything in a third-party tool, and they're going to try and protect you against things you can't modify in the web. That's a gap I think they just need to close.
Is this all connected like OneLake? Like you're directly connected?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I built a new model, so it's not the default data set. So in my head, I thought there was a bit of a separation there, but because again, how OneLake or Direct Lake works, it's not in a sense like it's not a copy. So everything has to be apples to apples.
Yeah, it just means you have to set it up correctly. I don't see any. This makes total sense to me.
You know, so no, but here's the problem though. In Tableau Editor 3, it doesn't do the conversion type because it doesn't
it's not on the web.
Come from pattern.
Yeah. It just means it means the other tools haven't caught up to what's going on.
Yeah.
Fine. Okay.
I mean, there's
I don't see this as an issue. I mean, I see it as an issue is that it'll break your stuff and it won't work. That's a problem. But like right now, it's hot off the press. I don't think a lot of people are like, wow, let's go build a whole bunch of things in Direct Lake. But I mean, I would say every time you use Power Query Online, the last two things you should do is rename your columns so they're correct and make sure your data types are correct. So if you don't do that, then it's going to break stuff.
I guess what's confusing to me, Tommy, is how like the Direct Lake mode just supported RLS. Like, where's the lofty expectation that it's going to work exactly like an imported model?
Right.
I understand like there's some frustration, but the fact that it's not working seamlessly with Tabular Editor, or that there are some things to iron out, I guess I'm a little less. Angry about
if we're actually going to start,
that's
fine. I feel like this is one of the basics ones, and the other part too is if we're going to even start rolling out initially, these are like the things that get fixed right away. If I have a data type, they need to be the same in both tools.
Well, the most important question I have, Tommy, is have you created a support ticket for Microsoft? Raised it up so that they can fix it?
Yeah. They don't know, right?
Yeah. Yes. No. Oh.
Okay. Well,
Tommy has had it already.
He's left the podcast. He's walking to the Microsoft to go tell him what's going on. So in other news then, so let's go. One of the other articles that came out here also recently, let's switch gears just here slightly. Let's move over to the Semantic Lake, an article called OneLake Integrated Semantic Models. And so this is an article that's talking about the semantic model and then the notebook experience, where a notebook can directly read what's inside OneLake. So you can import data using Power BI or using Power Query or whatever the pipelines thing is, load it to Lake. Now, when you use the integrated semantic model, you can read the OneLake experience without actually having to go through the compute of the model. Very interesting. So it's like the notebook is able to understand the semantic model, understand the relationships, and go read directly information right from, like, reading the table directly from the lake, which makes sense. I don't need to go through Power BI or the cached, direct lake query. I should be able to go to the same source of information, which is the same table, just inside OneLake, which I think is kind of a neat feature.
Honestly, to me, this is everywhere where I've been wanting. Like, I have this conversation about where does OneLake stand? Where is it kind of in the platform or in the journey? Well, again, the best part about what they've just integrated here is I can now, in a sense, build my lake houses without having just to build them also for the sake of building an analytical solution or building the reports and measures and relationships. I can just have the tables that a team can connect to, and then they can execute off of.
And there's another command in here that's also interesting. It's called fabric.execute TSML. So you can actually execute TSML directly against the lakehouse tables. And the example they give here is if you want some export code to export a table or export a full object from the lakehouse using the definition of the semantic model, you can go in and export a full Delta table from the lakehouse, which is kind of cool. So I'm not sure if I see all the use cases yet. Maybe there's going to be some use cases here for data science or other individuals accessing those tables. But it really does feel like whether I'm going through notebooks doing experiments, data science stuff, or other data cleaning exercises, or directly into the semantic model. I like this flexibility. Again, I'm just going to keep leaning on, I think you need to have plans on how this is going to work, because this means this is one more thing you connect to anything else. And we don't want to have one data set take down, all these different processes you're building. So you need to plan this out a little bit. Cool.
I'm a little bit confused on this one though. Like, is it everything in the semantic model? Like, meaning I can access measures, or is it just the relationships in the tables?
That's a good question. They didn't go that far in the article. Tommy, did you see that in the article there?
And well,
this is not really the semantic model though. This is the lake, the one lake.
Yeah, but Seth's asking is, like, if there's a measure on top of the semantic model, and you're asking for information out of the table with part of the semantic model in there, or the measure, basically, right? Are you getting that information? It sounds, the way I read this article, it sounds like you're just accessing the raw data that's in the tables. You're not, combining a measure or two into the information there as well.
I think you can even get shortcuts. There's a documentation link. And once you have that ability to connect to it, you can export the lake house. You can look at the shortcuts. So I imagine those would be available.
So isn't this very similar? Like, is this a business side way of, like, I'm going to connect to multiple data source, do ATL in Power BI, create a model, and then that's what's going to be exported to OneLake, and then I access it? Because
that's how I read it.
But then, like, I wouldn't want to use this model for my enterprise stuff, because to your point earlier, like, Mike, I have bronze, silver, gold, or I have some process for taking multiple data sources, curating data, creating facts and dimensions, and then plugging into that with my model.
Correct.
Like, the only difference between that and this is the relationships between the model tables, I guess.
I had to play with it a bit more.
Yeah. It's interesting.
I have this grand vision in my head where
we know you have grand vision.
I know, yes, yeah. Yeah. Like, again, not data types, but honestly though, this makes more sense than doing the semantic link with a Power BI data set, right? Because you're kind of adding this layer now where the business is controlling that, called the gold extra, where it's already the cleaned, refined tables. And not even assuming that.
I don't think it's that. I don't think it's even that level though. Like, I think you're actually, to me, this feels like a feature that is more of a, we're still trying to figure out what the data is doing. Like, this may be a business unit where you give them access, or they're doing their own thing, right? To me, this feels very much prior to a central BI team taking over the data set things. This is the step before that, or you're exploring or experimenting with things. This is where this is occurring. So I don't think this is coming from a central team.
Yeah, once we get farther, I'm not reading that like that at all. I'm reading a completely different way.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, and like I said, until people are rolling out, honestly, I wasn't even thinking that. I'm like, oh, great, they'll have a clean data set for data scientists. Perfect. But, well, maybe there's a lot of use cases, Mike. So.
All right, let's move on to some of our main topic for today. So let's transition on over to our main topic, which is really around Microsoft Fabric adoption roadmap. So let's jump into the article here. Kind of initial reads on this one. Change management. Let's maybe define change management a bit here at the beginning. Seth, maybe give me kind of a quick, what's the lens of Seth look like when I hear the word change management? What is the definition of Seth? Can I maybe get an intro around what change management looks like? Oh, I think you're muted.
I am muted because I'm got the head cold, coughing, sneezing, all that kind of stuff. Trying to hold it back. Thank you, Mike.
There you go.
I think we've talked about change management, I think, on the the dev level, right? Like,
yes.
as we're creating reports, and the business is going to come with new things to request and enhance and instantly come up with while we're developing, and the need for it there. But I think where this article, obviously coming from the adoption roadmap, and on the higher enterprise level dives into change management across the organization, right? And that's where I think there are multiple different points where a lot of it is people centric, right? We're going to be talking about process changes, and the article kind of alludes to giving some insights or some asking some questions and driving towards helping people implement these new adoption strategies potentially in areas where people are already doing maybe they're the Wild West of Power BI, or already have a very solid way in which they consume data, right? Like I have my Excel exports and that's what I use, or we use SSRS and I don't want your fancy stuff. So I think it walks through those different areas, and we can talk through each one of them related to what change management looks like and what are the pieces you need to kind of toggle as you're trying to change the behaviors of an organization to be more effective related to data culture and utilizing the business intelligence tools, obviously a la Power BI.
In the beginning part of the article, it talks a little bit around there are types of change to manage. And I think this resonates very true with organizations that I've been helping them walk through Power BI changes as well. One of those types of changes is a process level change. The second is a solution level change. And I think it's a very good distinction to break apart process and solutions. So maybe we should talk about these kind of things. Have you guys observed process level changes that are required in organizations? And do you have any examples of those process changes that you have seen or needed to be implemented? Tom, you want to?
The biggest ones were always for me the easiest ones were migrations, right? Where we're moving everyone from this tool to another tool, like it was all around the technology.
That's a solution change. Yeah. I'm asking about process changes. So a process change is we go to our, business object universe and we let people just dump Excel sheets, just whatever that is. Or a process level change might be something around workspace management, right? You've opened up Power BI, it's loaded up in multiple people's environments, and there is 10 admins on every workspace. You're like, well, I'm not sure if that is really what we should be doing. And when you read guidance around like how do you administer the workspace management of things, right? That might cause some, well, we probably shouldn't do that. We should probably have one admin, one member, and then a whole bunch of contributors to a workspace. So actually it's trying to use the workspace as a control mechanism for security. Another one that I'm thinking of here is content ownership. I think we've talked about this on the podcast a lot. Someone makes a data set and someone wants to build a report on top of that data set. Who owns the data set? Who owns the report? And I think a lot of times I hear in organizations, especially from those central teams that have been traditionally doing things centrally, they're like, well, we make the data set. We don't want anyone building reports. Well, then you don't want self-service. So to me, there's a lot of elements here of like there needs to be direct communication. That is, if some team builds the central data set and you're going to allow people to build reports on them, the people building those reports, they could do things that the numbers are not reported correctly. That's up to them. It's their responsibility. That business unit is going to be owning the responsibility of those numbers. Someone's going to own. There's a handover or exchange of responsibility during that interchange, and I think that's important here to be able to define when you're exchanging responsibility in this data process. It's hard.
Yeah. I think the two that stand out to me are like, I kind of look at the first 4 bullets as enhancements to solutions, right? Like we're going to go from more of a central team to sharing the responsibility of people within the organization, and you needing to find departmental experts that are going to start generating your own reports, right? And we'll help guide them, and teach them how to use the tools, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But where do you go for XYZ? Who's going to, how do you submit a request? Like, what people in an organization need to know where to go. Otherwise, they're going to have questions and they're going to solve it on their own. The largest process level one that I've directly encountered multiple times, and I think why it gets its own 5 extra sub bullet points, are the ones around changing from one reporting tool to another, like Power BI, right? And especially when it's in the form of, we always get our reports emailed to us, right? In some sort of file. We always export to reporting services paginated reports. We like in the form that people have always been, consuming, which is just static. I've seen the most pushback around, like, don't mess with my, standard stock way of getting things. And I think that's why they have like multiple different bullets underneath the migration from other analytics products to, they say Fabric, but Power BI, right, as a reporting tool.
Yes.
And that's where I think it's really important to define what that process is and what are the artifacts that can come out of that in the change, and why you're going to progress from just, a static way of doing things or consuming information to an on-demand one. And one right off the bat is, listen, like, yes, we can have a system that generates, 5,000 reports and emails it to everybody in the organization.
Yeah,
we also know that only 2% of the organization actually looks at the report. So our efficiency is 2%, right? Like that's a waste of resources and time. If you are interested in this report, you can access it right here by this link, and creating a centralized location, which the Power BI service does, even better in apps, right? Like, that's a compelling change from, yes, it's not going to show up in your email. There is nothing different than you looking in your email or opening up Teams or opening up Power BI, right?
Yeah,
like,
true.
That's where your reports live. Your whole world doesn't need to revolve around email. So, like, it's those types of conversations that
like
are
that
like
one.
point by point by point, where there's a reason why you want to make this change, right? The benefit is we're going to save a lot of money in cost of generating things, and we're still going to provide you a central portal where you can go access this even in a better way. If you still want paginated, we can provide that, right? But it's an on-demand model as opposed to this older model of like, well, we can't service you and give you these reports unless we start at midnight, because our systems won't allow us to generate all these reports at the same time.
Yeah.
Right. And
it's
now
physically
we have
a limitation.
those capabilities. Exactly.
Yeah. And I think you make a really good point in there. One, I think you're making the allusion to it. It's the idea that
alluding to it.
Hopefully
not the illusion.
No, alluding to it. Sorry, wrong word. But you're alluding to the idea of, a lot of organizations are used to emailed, static, generated lists of data, just kind of pushing data out to people and saying, here you go, have at it. I think in the new world here, we're talking about more of a responsive on-demand need, where this cube or this report or this model will always be up to date, and when you need it, you go visit it. As opposed to a push method, you're doing more of a pull method. Go get what you want, as opposed to, here, I'm just going to keep pushing junk to you in your emails. Because it just seems very inefficient, right? To your point.
Yeah.
And
that's a really big one.
I'm really glad you made that distinction with the solution versus the process, because the solution is always easy to sell. I think part of those migrations are there is a need. Maybe it's just to get everyone all going the same direction across the teams, but it's so difficult to communicate, or it's much harder for anyone to see the same value of, well, we're going to switch tools, or we're all migrating to this great new feature, so I'll invest the time in my team to do so. But if it's those small minor changes that we all know, or what are kind of more in the background, for one of the biggest ones I could think of was just moving people off of workspaces and go to Teams apps, and just how one of the organizations did it. They're like, well, we've been fine. Like, no one's complained about viewing reports in the workspace.
Correct.
Like, K. And that the other part too is that they're as happy as where they are. So it's like there's something called Power BI apps, and then you're trying to sell them, but at the same time, it's a longer process, especially when they're like, I'm already happy, or people are content. So part of what the article says, but what I've always seen is it is the communication. Any change management initiative that's going out, to me, always has a communication plan 30, or I don't want to say everything's different, but there is a much longer time of planning it out. I've rolled out some of these, like we were releasing a product, like the next Apple iPhone, like, hey, in 2 months, we're doing this this change. We're going to apps. Okay, we're going to keep speaking about this.
Yep.
Just to let everybody know that it was coming down. So for me, it's about that communication with people, and it's about then trying to sell the value.
So we've kind of talked about, I think I agree with that one, Tommy. I think your comment leads us into like the next section in the article, which starts talking about addressing the changes that you're talking about incrementally. And I think I have observed this. If you change too much all at once, everyone freaks out and like, whoa, this is so different. There's no way I could learn all this. I'm too busy to learn all the new things. And I think this is, this works in businesses. This works in all kinds of other areas outside of just doing Power BI adoption. But I really do think it's important to use this next section, really go through these steps, right? Define what is changing, describe the impact of the change, because I think that really helps people identify like, hey, we're doing like, this is going to save us money. It's going to save us time. Like to your point earlier, Seth, right? There's some communication points that go along with why we're doing this change management. Then identify our priorities, because that's an alignment piece. Like, hey, the organization has decided to go this direction. This is why we're going this direction. Plan on implementing the change as pieces, and it may be multiple steps, and then create an action plan for each phase. So it's really, to your point, Tommy, being methodical, communicating often. Here's what we're going to do. Here's why we're doing it. Here's the action plan. Here's the different milestones we're going to hit to get there. It's very important. And without this, I think a lot of these initiatives flop.
I do like the distinction between the two, because on some levels, I don't think you may even have to deal with process level change, right? Like if you already you already have your central or decentralized team, or a mix of both, and people are working within Power BI, right? Like you could have the Wild West going, and really solution level changes are really where change management needs to be applied, because there's a lot of confusion that can happen in solution level changes as well.
And I'm sorry, I apologize, because I was thinking through the section on addressing change incrementally, and a lot of the bullet points I actually made were in the next section, which is called communicating effectiveness of the change, or the communication of those changes. What's changing, why it's changing, when it's changing, any other further context as well there. As I'm reading through this, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to outline some of the solution level changes that they
oh yeah, go ahead.
Kind of because we're looking at it, but the audience probably isn't at the same time. But like some examples of solution level change are like calculation logic, right? Underneath KPIs and measures. Those are going to change, right? Like if people rely on them or have understood all of the nuance underneath the calculation, and then you're like, no, actually, we're going to make it like this. That can be very disruptive. How master data is working, business attributes are mapped, grouped, data freshness, right? Like how often a report gets updated. Advanced analytics concepts, and this is where I think we're going to talk a lot about communication, but like we've talked ad nauseum about just simple report representation of a visual, right? Like this is a challenging visual. Now you throw in advanced analytics and some of the things that now there's this model, and what this does is trying to explain that to a business
totally
in a simplified manner takes a lot more communication. And then it goes on like changes in the presentation, right? Styling, colors, formatting, type of visualization. This is where we're huge proponents of themes, right? Creating a standard way in which people look at and consume data, because that can be very disruptive, right? Like all of a sudden, like, hey, we hired a new guy and his name is Tommy Puglia, and Tommy just built a brand new report. And then people look at it, they're like, oh my gosh, like this looks nothing like anything.
There's no visual language. Yeah.
Where do I go?
And especially if you're coming out of a central team, I think this is even more important when that central team is producing these things, right? Everything that comes out of that central team should kind of look and feel the same. And you should be able to write documentation about one report that kind of illuminates the patterns across all reports. The buttons should look the same. The visual style should look, I think it really helps from a consistency standpoint to have that.
Where have you, in any of these bullet points, have you guys gotten bitten or seen in organizations that are like the biggest ones that got changed without proper change management that caused the biggest strife? Because the outcome of not having, and it's really like communication and having paths of communicating. I think these changes is the change management solution. But like, man, you want to see a nuke go off or like massive disruption of a whole bunch of questions getting flooded into your team. Like they're in here.
Oh, totally. I think master data is one that I've found that has been particularly struggling just in general with organizations. Who owns what kind of data for that master information? Some companies buy tools that help manage that information. Other companies try and just collect it across the organization and put it someplace. I think master data management is a very difficult process. Because if you think of and where I got burned or where I've seen people getting burned is you have one row of data in that, but every column in that row of data may be owned by a different team. You sell, a product, a widget, whatever that thing is. Mm. There's lots of teams potentially in charge of various aspects of that product. And so you need multiple teams to kind of work together to define what is it that you're selling. And that's hard to do, to coordinate across multiple teams. And keep it up to date. It always seems to get stale for some reason.
What about you, Tommy?
Dude, this is maybe one of the easiest answers I've had, and but it's definitely off of the measure changes or business logic changes to calculations.
Yeah. What is a customer? How do we? How do we actually calculate this? Like define the metric, right?
And then it changes, and so it's taking us just enough time to come to an agreement, right? And especially too, like with legacy tools, like, well, we were able to do this in Excel, no problem. Why is it so slow here? Or what's causing the issue of it not being correct here? I thought Power BI was this quick. I have heard that before. Like this was supposed to be better, but honestly, just those slow changes, like, oh well. Fred's now on the Northwest sales team now, and that's going to be effective next week. So make sure all is quoted. You're like, cool. So and those things are constantly happening. Hopefully you already have other things in place where, like more upstream of how the data is getting ingested, but there's still the revisions to, oh, well, don't include these people. And we want to, the company's not looking at this way. So it's not so much about getting it done in time. It is being skilled in the workflow or the ability to allow that change to go through the right people.
Yeah.
Right. Because it has to get to you and it has to get to you effectively.
One of the one, which is probably one of the simplest, but I'm glad it's on here. I would put probably under changes in data freshness. As causing some of the most consternation, because like and the way I look at it is this, not just the freshness of the report, which I think a lot of people now have like putting a freshness date, like last refreshed as of, right? Is conveying complex pipelines that cycle in very short periods of time that all have to execute appropriately before the Power BI refresh, right? So some of the challenges in there related to asynchronous refresh of Power BI versus production pipeline, where you have multiple different copy transformation, modification, modeling of steps that have to be done prior to a certain time. And if you miss that time window, an asynchronous process won't pick up the changes. So even if you do have a freshness date, like trying to explain that to people in the business is very difficult.
Yeah.
And I think leads to better solutions where if you can, at wherever possible, have that a seamless pipeline where all of those ETL orchestration activities are happening, and then they kick off a refresh when they're done, right? But then you have this ambiguity where if somebody's looking for something at a certain time every day, well, that's going to depend on the load, right? Like sometimes there are mitigating factors behind the scenes. So, like, we know lots of things happen before just the visual layer.
Yeah.
And I think communicating that or not being able to simplify that to a level for the business to understand is one of the hardest things I've encountered.
I like that one. That's a good one too. Synchronization of data loading. Well, with DirectLink, it'll be much easier because you just, there's no import.
There's no refresh.
As
model.
I've heard,
yeah,
right? It just works.
But it's not. Yeah. How would you? You'd still need.
You still need to hydrate the tables underneath the data model.
You don't have to refresh the.
You just don't have to refresh. So it potentially can cut out sometimes. So we have some processes at some customers that do this very similar thing, right? There was this lead time to be able to get things into a model. The model was created in Azure, and all of a sudden now we had to go refresh data sets. Well, there was a lot of data sets. The data sets were using a lot of information. So we had to stage them. And so everyone's like, well, we want all our data by 8 a.m. Well, we had to load things earlier because it needed time to get through all that stuff. You're backing things up. So to get rid of one portion of that step would be very, very helpful in that way as well. Want to move on further in the article?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So I think the section here, effectively communicating change and or planning, training, and support, I think would be kind of good to move on to next. I think these are other areas that I think are lacking, as I've seen in many organizations, the planning or the communication of the plan, and then how do they actually conduct the training.
I actually want to back up 1 second.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
There's one section in there that I think is also fantastic, and it's addressing change incrementally, because in there are the bullet points of defining the change, and the second point in there is describing the impact of the change.
Yes.
Identifying priorities. What is the plan on how to incrementally implement the change, and then create an action plan? Like, that section is gold to me, because it's like, hey, before you start going, take a moment, define the need, describe the impact that it's having, and what is the solution? What is the new direction, and why is that a good one that we're going to head down? And here's how we get there in a step-by-step passion.
I like those as well. I think this is a great section as well. I think a lot of this stuff doesn't get skipped, or we don't think about these. I mean, when you step back and take a look at the process of what's going on, I think you can easily say, yeah, this makes sense. But when you're in the thick of building a solution, changing something, you're the one running Power BI, these don't come to top of mind. You're just focusing on getting this thing out the door. And I feel like a lot of these steps, to have some guidance to step back and say, this is how we should plan out the work, is incredibly helpful here.
Yeah, and I wonder, this is going to be a segue and somewhat parking lot. Recently in our organization, we went through personality profiling, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of those things that is striking is, I think, that mentality, Mike, of just actions, doers.
Yep.
We get things done, right? Like, bam.
Sure.
is a type of personality where more of, like, what are things that you're prone to skipping, right? Like communicating the change, communicating things to other parts of the organization. Well, I'm like, we're just going to do it. We're going to here, I'm going to provide the solution. Bam.
Yeah.
But it's really important to say, hey guys, here's the layout. Here's what we need to do. Here's why we're going to do it. And then here's your expected timeline. And then I get to go do my thing. And then I'll tell you when it's done. Right. Like,
yeah,
I think it leans into parts of this are like, hey, we're have stronger proclivities to skip parts. Whereas I love the adoption roadmap. And to your point, it's really cool to go through these parts and be like, oh, well, you may not think it's important, but it is. So force yourself to go through these steps, because there are parts of all of this that you may or may not gravitate towards, but are important across the board.
This, I think, becomes extremely true when you're trying to migrate teams off of other tools into Power BI. Because a lot of times, to your point, companies get acquired, you buy, if those companies come with a different tool, right? You at some point you kind of wind up with your organization having Tableau and Click and Power BI and maybe different departments or whatever the versions of teams have different tooling. If you're trying to then make the entire company move to the same tool, now you have that kind of effort of, okay, we've got to communicate the impact of why this is changing and what we're doing, why this is requiring new workloads here. And then some people will love it and be like, okay, this is great. I get what I need and we can move on. But other people will just not be happy with those changes. And, they make a choice to stay with the company or move on to someplace else where they can use their skills they've already learned in these other tools.
Yeah, that's certainly a point in here, and I think way at the bottom, way at the bottom for some reason is executive like make sure you're not doing this in the silo, right? Like you need executive support.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that organizations can't use multiple tools to solve business problems,
True.
right? If the value enough of value is there to say, yeah, no, this department can still use this tool, and we want it that way because we are servicing a particular product for a customer, and this is what we're gonna like keep doing as opposed to do a migration into Power BI or whatever the case may be. So it's worth it for us to have a aspect of our organization where we have resources that understand and know how to use that tool, right? Because the other part of this is, if you can get alignment on tool sets and technologies and everybody starts to learn them, then you have a lot more bandwidth across the board, right? Like you're not putting yourself at risk for an area that just held on to their tool and now two people left and nobody knows how to support it. That's the worst thing that can happen to a business.
Yeah,
right.
Totally.
And one of the reasons why you get these cross broad kind of things that say, all right, like we're taking a concerted effort. We're looking at like which tools and technologies we want to use, and we've chosen these for these reasons, and now we're going to move on to them.
Yeah.
Well, so that raises an interesting point though, because it's probably like the origin of when those changes are actually going to play, because there are some changes that you may want done. You're like, this is just be a better process that it's either not going to be a winning value or it's not worth it. It's like, oh, I really wish if everyone, labeled things a certain way. Obviously we get too granular. And I think especially those who are knee deep in the best practices, we also know that's not really the case. The point being, when these changes are going to get rolled out, both the ones that are going to be all fancy and everyone's going to notice, and the ones that are just seem to be more work, there needs to be not just communication with downstream on those who are affected, but with your COE, but also with your boss too, on what are those initiatives that you're going to make people do. So at least you have that buy-in too. I have had a lot of hard conversations with my bosses where there are some things that I just thought would be a better way, but she knew that all the other battles trying to be fought at that time too, which is there always are. Sometimes not everything is completely practical.
Well, I think if I look through these like next two sections around effectively communicate change and planning, training, and support, both of those areas, as I'm thinking through this, by going through and communicating what's changing, why it's changing, when it's changing, this gives time for people to react and push back a little bit. And I think there is this normal feedback loop of, here's what we're changing, here's why we're doing things new. People need to ask questions to get alignment, to get on board with the direction. So you need, like, this is the same way I build reports. It doesn't make sense for you just to go out and build a report all by yourself and come back to a business unit and say, here's your report, this is what you asked for. Because if you don't ask for their engagement along the process, you're going to build what you heard them say is a different interpretation of what they need. And I've also had a lot of times when building reports, and again, taking the report experience and translating this over to Power BI migrations, the report experience, you kind of have to lead people along a journey. Here's what we're going to do. These are the insights. Here's why we're going to put these visuals on the page. As you walk people through that journey, I think you can get closer to a report that people are happy with. In the same way, I see this as a very similar solution. the more you communicate with people, the more you can get alignment all throughout the process. And that way, at the end of the solution, they're like, oh, I get it now. I understand why we're doing workspace deployments this way. I understand why we're using apps now because I understand the nuances of security and how we're going to try to use that. So I think a lot of this is when you're communicating change, it really helps because many organizations I walk into, they say, yeah, we're good at we're already doing Power BI, we're good at it. But when I ask basic skill sets around things, there's not skills there. There's not the general knowledge we would need to say these are the thresholds by which your company needs to have in order to be effective in Power BI. We ask people about filter context. They don't know what that means. Why are you using all these implicit measures? There's a whole bunch of implicit measures on reports. Well, it just works. Understood, but that's a very fundamental layer of understanding up in the levels to get to a level where you understand why and what you're doing. So the training and support is also very important here because you're going to find there's going to be gaps in your team's knowledge around where you are to where you want to be.
Yeah, I think the nugget that struck me is like when we're talking about communicating these changes, I think there's a significant difference between everyone already agrees change needs to happen, and this is a good article and a good litmus for like you to go down to figure out like how do you strategically go about that change versus you poking on like the other part where someone's pushing for change to happen because you've learned these things and nobody else yet is on that bandwagon of like,
true.
Yeah, we need to make these changes. Because I think those are two different things when we talk about looking at this article, because you need that buy-in first before you're going to be able to go like down the vast majority of these routes. Now, like, can you modify your own solution? Can you apply change management to some of the solution? Yeah, absolutely. But on a higher level, it's gonna be a rough road. But I think by rough road, what I mean though, Tommy, is like to your point, you brought up like you bringing these changes to someone above you and them saying it's not the right time. I take that in two ways, right? One is that person saying great idea, and in the back of their head they're like nope, right? Or it's great idea. It isn't the right time from a like all this stuff happening within the organization that you're not aware of, blah, 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 blah. But then the follow-up to that should be let's plan for this, because if it's not the right time, and I agree with you, then we have to prep for when it is the right time, right? And that's why you would start to go down like investing a little bit of time to start planning out, okay, yeah, these changes absolutely need to happen. Start putting together, the plan a little bit. That's that area of like, I think it's under address incrementally, right? It's just going to be a longer incremental change. It's not going to be like we're going to condense it and gangbusters, we got to go do it, because the organization can't handle that. So maybe it's like, okay, Tommy, that's great. Define what's changing, right? Describe the impact of the organization. We'll identify what the priorities are, and then we plan how to incrementally add it, right?
Yeah.
And in the add it part could be one that has to be phased in, because maybe your organization is rolling out 3 apps, right? That they expect the organization to like, everybody needs to start using this stuff. And it's like, oh my gosh, like, now we're going to try to throw in a 4th change management of like this other application, this other tool, like probably not a good time, because you're going to get lost in the mix, right? So those sorts of things I understand, but I wouldn't accept like, oh, that's a great idea, now's not the right time, and then just like that's the end of the conversation, because that probably leads to the fact that they don't agree with you.
And there's you have to understand there will be disagreement, and I think the idea here is it will happen. You need to make sure you have business alignment. And this is what the note here, the caution note here inside Involve Executive Leadership does. It says, caution, resistance to change from executive leadership is often a warning sign because there needs to be stronger business alignment. The business alignment is needed between the business and the BI strategies. In this scenario, consider specific alignment sessions that are only talking about change management actions with only executive leadership. That is a very well-crafted statement, and I would agree. When executive sponsors, and this is where I think Matthew Roach talks about this at length, about if you want a successful BI deployment, it starts with executive management. Someone at the top has to identify, this is the direction we're going to go. And to your point, Seth, there is a roadmap. It may not be as fast as you want, but there is a roadmap. There are certain milestones that we will work on, learn, teach people, and we will get forward towards as we go through this process. That's really good.
Yeah, I think ultimately, like, and we're running out of time, so like skipping through, like, involving stakeholders, involving people in this process too, right? Important. It's not like you can just be like, hey, Tommy, me and you, we're gonna change everything, and here's the plan, and then like, bam, like, hey, rest of the organization, here's what we're doing. It's like, whoa, what?
Yeah.
So involving people early and often is important to get alignment, but I think the important parts about handling resistance is in involving your executive sponsor, right? Like, and having that person is absolutely paramount in these larger organizational efforts. And it's not because you're gonna butt heads. There are gonna be people that don't agree with you, and that's fine. But if everything in what you're doing is laid out to solve the business problems, and you have agreement and alignment that this is the strategy that's going to solve those business problems, then it's just a matter of like working through those issues that people that are resistant to this change have, so that you're bringing them along for the ride. You don't want to create enemies in of this, because like the reason you're going through change management, developing or readjusting processes, is because in the long term, you and the organization believe that this is better or going to be more efficient for the organization. And like to this other point of having a community and everybody working and around the same tool that can work with the business but still work in enterprise is one of Power BI's biggest strengths. Is there some technical learning that has to happen on the business front end? Yeah, but when you unify that conversation across an organization, it's so much more effective because everybody starts speaking the same language, right? Everybody starts to work around like, here's how data works in our ecosystem. Here's how, we're going to implement a new process. Oh, that's not really a big deal because we're all familiar. So like raising the data culture and the data understanding and literacy is part and parcel. Like, does everybody in the business understand how to use the tool sets that are provided to them? And then they learn more about the back end parts of it to some degree. And I think that's one of the most valuable things about being able to like leverage these new technologies and new reporting tools across the whole swath of the organization.
I agree with that as well. As we kind of wrap here, I know we're kind of at time here. We'll kind of do last thoughts here, just a moment. There's a lot more we didn't cover the entire article. There's a couple other really good points here to talk about identifying and engage your promoters of what you're doing. I think that's important. And then identifying and engaging those detractors, probably even more so important. Find out who's going to resist you and engage them. Have those conversations, understand their concerns, let their concerns be heard so you can bring them in and address those concerns. So that way they can also adopt and drive with this one. The last two pieces in the article are talking about questions to ask. Highly recommend reading through that. They're talking through areas of, are there teams and responsibilities for data management? If so, where is that in the organization, right? Do people create Excel reports and feel threatened or frustrated by using new BI tools, right? These are good questions to kind of get a head read around as you're adopting, as you're transitioning. These are the questions that are going to cause friction. Identify, are there problems here you need to identify? And then lastly, I'll point out one thing that's been very well done in a lot of the adoption roadmap is there's always this a method of going through different, how do you respond to these different, in change management, how does your company respond to change management? And there's a leveling assessment, a 100 level all the way up to 500 level. And I really think these are really good for organizations to go through and actually go through each of these sections and say, where do we feel like we fit? Do we fit at a 200 or 300 level? And because when you identify those things, these are short bullet points, and you can kind of see where you are maturity-wise. You're not going to go from a 100 to a 400 in one day. It just won't happen. But you need to identify where you're at and then start implementing some, change management around it to get yourself to the next level up. So I think those are also really good as well. In this conversation, let's just kind of transition into final thoughts. Tommy, give us some of your final thoughts around this article. What stood out to you, or what would you say would be your, nugget that you came away from this one?
I've felt this way for a while, but the ironic thing is this skill set, and this is the skill set to be able to do this, has nothing to do with Power BI. At the end of the day, of course, it's around Power BI, but it's just our ability dealing with the technology and being able to effectively communicate. No one knew that they were signing up for that too when they went into business intelligence. That, because I know that was the last thing that I thought. It's like, what tools do I have? Like, am I going to use Trello for communication? How do we roll that out? That becomes a skill that you need to get, because that's such a big part of what we do.
Good point. Seth, any kind of final thoughts for yourself?
Yeah, I would scroll to the bottom of the article and hit the maturity levels, right? Because one of the great things about those, and there's many different flavors of this for different conversations, but it allows you to identify and get agreement on where you are, right, with other people in the organization. And if you know where you are, then it also alludes to like where you could go if you invest in time in these types of activities. So these are big efforts. Create a plan. Doesn't need to be exhaustive. Just start, have an idea what are the biggest movers and prioritize, like what are the biggest things within your organization that could use some change management, and start somewhere. It's an incremental thing, but it's important to start somewhere.
That's a great point. I think my final thoughts on this one are really around getting the buy-in of executive leadership. I think that really becomes very important to organizations. Plus, a lot of times I see the person in the middle, the BI management team, the leader of Power BI, isn't necessarily always the executive sponsor. So sometimes you're managing up a little bit. And if you're going to move this direction, if you're going to provide good practices around moving to Power BI, it makes you look really good to come into your boss or your executive sponsor and say, here's a plan. Here's what I'd like to do. Here's what I'm going to communicate. Here's what we're doing, why it's efficient. Like, that looks really good to them, because they like, look, Tommy, Seth, you've got these things under wraps. You know what you're doing. You have a plan in place on how you're communicating and what you're going to do to address people that are proponents and detractors from your new world that you're going to produce. That's very important to acknowledge that happens. And that way you can use that to your advantage and say, look, I've already tried to think about these things. I may not have everything, but you can use a lot of this article to kind of give you an outline of here's what we should be thinking about as we move more towards Power BI.
Yeah.
Great article. Super good learning there. Really appreciate this one. The link is in the description, as well as it's also in the chat here a couple times. So everyone, thank you very much for listening and joining us today for this conversation around change management. I hope you are going to change what you're doing today or this week. And if you wouldn't mind, please change someone else's mind and have them come listen to the podcast. So we'd really would love a recommendation from you if you found value from this conversation today. Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You're going to find us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. Make sure to subscribe and leave a rating. It helps us out a ton. Do you have a question, an idea, or a topic that you want us to talk about in a future episode? We'll just head over to Power BI Tips/podcast. And finally, join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central, and join the conversation on all Power BI Tips social media channels.
Excellent. With that, thank you all very much. We appreciate your time today, and have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.